A few hours after Christina Lewis gave birth to healthy newborn twins, her husband walked through the maternity ward without once asking if she had eaten, rested, or even held their children. Instead, Paul stood near the window, accepting congratulations for his company's newest expansion, smiling proudly while nurses exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone in the room saw a man celebrating success and a woman carrying silence. None of them knew that every dollar behind the empire Paul admired could disappear with a single lawful decision made by the exhausted mother he had chosen to ignore. If you believe quiet integrity always reveals the truth in the end, share where you're watching from and your local time in the comments. And if stories of dignity, justice, and resilience speak to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey. Christina Lewis had never believed that the loudest person in a room was the strongest. Long before she became a wife, and long before she became the mother of twins, she had learned that genuine authority often arrived without applause. It appeared in careful decisions, patient listening, and promises honored even when no one else was watching. Those lessons had shaped every important choice she made. Few people knew where Christina had come from. To most of her friends, she was simply an intelligent woman with a graduate degree in nonprofit management who preferred quiet coffee shops to expensive restaurants. She volunteered at children's literacy programs on weekends, donated anonymously to local shelters, and wore clothes chosen for comfort rather than status. Her modest apartment before marriage contained more books than decorations, and she drove the same reliable sedan for nearly 8 years, without ever considering whether someone else found it impressive. She had never tried to look wealthy because wealth had never defined her life. Her family name, however, carried influence in circles she rarely entered. For generations, the Lewis family had quietly funded hospitals, universities, medical research, veterans organizations, and scholarship foundations across the United States. Their charitable trust had grown through decades of disciplined investments and responsible stewardship instead of publicity. Newspapers occasionally mentioned the Lewis Family Trust when announcing large donations, but almost no articles identified the people responsible for directing it. That privacy was intentional. Christina's grandmother, Margaret Lewis, had insisted that philanthropy lost part of its purpose the moment generosity became performance. "When people thank your name more than they thank the work," Margaret often said, "you've already begun forgetting why you gave." Christina had never forgotten those words. By the time she finished graduate school, Margaret had already begun preparing her granddaughter for responsibilities that extended far beyond financial wealth. Meetings with trustees were never lessons about luxury. They were discussions about ethics, accountability, and protecting institutions that thousands of families depended upon without ever realizing it. Daniel Harper, the trust's chief trustee, often reminded younger advisors of one principle. "Money solves very little," he would tell them. "Judgment determines whether money helps or harms." Christina listened more than she spoke during those meetings. Years later, Daniel would privately admit that she had become the calmest decision-maker he had ever worked beside. That quiet discipline was exactly why only a handful of people knew what had happened after Margaret gradually stepped away from daily leadership. Without any public announcement, without interviews, ceremonies, or celebrations, Christina Lewis became the sole controlling trustee of one of the largest charitable trust funds in the country. The transition was completed through attorneys' signed resolutions and carefully documented legal procedures. Nothing about it attracted headlines. Christina preferred it that way. Then she met Paul. They first crossed paths during a community fundraising event, where Paul volunteered as a young project manager representing a regional construction company. He worked long hours, carried tables without being asked, stayed late to clean the venue, and treated volunteers with respect, regardless of their titles. At least that was the man Christina believed she had met. He never asked about her family's background. He never questioned why she avoided conversations about money. Instead, he talked about building something meaningful with his own hands. He dreamed of creating a company that developed affordable housing while remaining financially successful. His ambition impressed Christina because it appeared connected to purpose instead of ego. They spent months getting to know each other. Weekend walks replaced expensive vacations. Homemade dinners replaced luxury dates. Paul often joked that the best evenings cost almost nothing. Christina smiled because she agreed. When he proposed, it happened during a quiet evening beside a lake rather than inside an extravagant restaurant. There were no photographers, no audience, no elaborate speech, only a simple promise. "I'll spend my life choosing us," Paul had said. Christina believed him. For the first several years of marriage, that promise seemed genuine. They celebrated small victories together. Paul earned promotions. Christina continued consulting for nonprofit organizations, while quietly attending trustee meetings several times each year under strict confidentiality. Whenever business discussions required her signature, she completed them privately through Daniel Harper and Victoria Bennett, the trust's senior attorney. Paul never questioned those occasional meetings. Christina described them only as family administrative responsibilities. Technically, that explanation was true. She never lied. She simply never explained the full picture because revealing it would have fundamentally changed the nature of their marriage. She wanted to be loved for herself, not for influence that existed long before they met. Years passed. Paul's career accelerated faster than either of them expected. Promotions became executive responsibilities. Executive responsibilities became leadership opportunities. Leadership eventually transformed into recognition from investors' industry magazines and business organizations. With every success, Paul's calendar became more crowded. Business dinners replaced family dinners. Weekend meetings replaced weekend walks. Phone calls interrupted conversations. Emails arrived before sunrise and continued well past midnight. Christina noticed the changes gradually. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. Instead, thousands of tiny disappointments quietly accumulated. Anniversaries shortened because clients needed attention. Vacations were postponed. Promises became apologies. Apologies slowly became expectations. Whenever Christina suggested slowing down, Paul answered with confidence, "I'm doing this for our future." She wanted to believe him. Then she became pregnant. The news initially brought genuine excitement. Paul hugged her tightly. He spoke about decorating a nursery. He downloaded parenting books onto his tablet. He even canceled several meetings during the first few months to attend medical appointments. For a brief time, Christina thought the growing distance between them might finally disappear. Then an opportunity arrived. Paul's company announced negotiations for its largest expansion in history. Investors celebrated. Executives predicted national recognition. Financial publications described the project as transformational. Paul threw himself completely into making it succeed. The pregnancy slowly became something scheduled between conference calls. He still loved the idea of becoming a father. He simply believed there would always be more time later. Christina never argued. Instead, she quietly adjusted. She attended appointments alone whenever necessary. She read parenting books by herself. She assembled cribs, folded tiny clothes, and prepared the nursery during peaceful afternoons while soft music played through the house. She kept a notebook beside her bed. Inside it, she wrote practical reminders for feeding schedules, pediatric recommendations, and future milestones she hoped Paul would share with their children. She never imagined the notebook would eventually become a record of moments that never happened. During her 7th month of pregnancy, doctors informed the couple they were expecting twins, a son and a daughter. Paul smiled with genuine surprise. For one evening, business disappeared from his thoughts. He held Christina's hands and laughed like the young man she had first met years earlier. She treasured that memory because it would become increasingly rare. As the due date approached, Paul's company prepared its public expansion announcement. Board meetings intensified. Investor presentations multiplied. His phone rarely stopped ringing. Meanwhile, Christina's pregnancy became physically exhausting. Carrying twins placed additional strain on her body. Simple tasks required longer rests. Even climbing stairs demanded patience. Still, she refused to complain. She observed. She adapted. She endured, because somewhere beneath disappointment, she continued hoping that once Ethan and Grace entered the world, Paul would remember the promise he had made beside the quiet lake years before. She had no way of knowing that the first hours after their birth would reveal just how much that promise had changed. The first week after Ethan and Grace came home should have been remembered for sleepless nights softened by quiet joy. Instead, it became a lesson in absence. The nursery was filled with gentle sounds, the rhythmic hum of a white noise machine, the tiny cries that arrived every few hours, and the whispered lullabies Christina sang while moving carefully from one crib to the other. Morning blended into afternoon, and afternoon disappeared into another night without either parent noticing the passage of time, except that only one of them was truly living those hours. Paul's suit jackets no longer stayed in the bedroom closet for long. They disappeared before sunrise and returned after midnight, often carrying the scent of hotel conference rooms, expensive restaurants, and freshly printed presentation folders. His explanation rarely changed. The expansion is entering its most important phase. The investors need reassurance. I'll make it up to all of you once this quarter is over. Christina never interrupted him. She simply nodded while warming bottles or rocking whichever twin had awakened first. She had discovered something during pregnancy. Arguments consumed energy. Silence preserved it. Every ounce of strength now belonged to Ethan and Grace. The twins could not have been more different despite sharing the same birthday. Ethan rarely cried for long. He seemed content once he felt someone's heartbeat beneath his cheek, often falling asleep against Christina's shoulder after only a few minutes. Grace demanded attention with remarkable determination. Her cries were louder, her expressions more animated, and her tiny fingers instinctively searched for Christina's hand every time she woke. Christina smiled at the contrast. "They're already teaching each other balance," she whispered one evening. No one answered. Paul was attending another dinner with potential investors nearly 40 miles away. The following morning, he stopped briefly at home to change clothes. He kissed the top of Christina's head without noticing the dark circles beneath her eyes. "Did they sleep?" he asked, while checking emails on his phone. "A little." "That's good." He walked toward the kitchen. Christina waited. She thought perhaps he would ask to hold them. Perhaps he would peek inside the nursery. Perhaps he would smile the way he had when they first learned there would be twins. Instead, Paul poured coffee into a travel mug. "My driver will be here in 5 minutes." He glanced toward the hallway leading to the nursery. "I'll see them this weekend." It was Tuesday. By Friday evening, another emergency meeting had appeared on his calendar. Weekend became next week. Next week became another promise. The pattern settled quietly into their lives. Christina stopped expecting specific dates. She focused instead on routines she could control. Every morning, she recorded the twins' weight, feeding times, and sleeping schedules. Their pediatrician appreciated her detailed notes. "You've documented everything," the doctor said during one appointment. Christina smiled politely. "I don't like forgetting important things." That sentence described far more than childcare. Each evening after the twins finally fell asleep, Christina opened a leather notebook. She wrote the date. Then she recorded facts. No opinions, no accusations, only facts. Paul absent for morning feeding. Missed pediatric appointment. Promised to return by dinner. Arrived after midnight. 15-minute phone conversation interrupted family meal. Business trip extended without notice. She never exaggerated. She never speculated about motives. She simply documented reality exactly as it unfolded. The notebook slowly became thicker. Not because dramatic events occurred, but because ordinary disappointments accumulated with extraordinary consistency. Several weeks later, Paul appeared on the cover of a regional business magazine. The headline praised his leadership during one of the fastest corporate expansions in the industry. The accompanying interview described him as a visionary executive balancing innovation with family values. Christina paused while reading those words. Family values. She looked toward the nursery where Ethan slept peacefully while Grace kicked her blanket loose for the third time that afternoon. The article quoted Paul proudly. "My family reminds me every day why building a stronger future matters." Christina folded the magazine. She placed it beside her notebook without making any comment. Later that evening, she clipped the interview and tucked it inside a folder already containing newspaper articles, corporate press releases, and public speeches. Not because she wished to expose him, because accuracy mattered. Public statements often became relevant when compared with private actions. Daniel Harper called the following Tuesday. His voice remained calm, as always. "I hope I'm not interrupting. The twins just finished eating. How are you?" "Tired." "I expected that." A brief silence followed. Daniel had known Christina since she was a teenager. He recognized the difference between exhaustion and distress. "You sound thoughtful." "I've had time to observe. I imagine motherhood encourages that." "It does." Daniel hesitated before changing subjects. "Our annual compliance review begins next month." Christina understood immediately. Every year, the Lewis Family Trust reviewed every major investment, charitable partnership, and long-term financial commitment. The process protected both the trust and the organizations receiving its support. Normally, these reviews attracted little attention. This year would be different. Paul's company had become one of the Trust's largest indirect investment beneficiaries through several interconnected funding structures established years earlier. Daniel continued carefully. "There are several documents requiring your authorization." "I'll review them." "No urgency. We simply wanted you informed before formal notices are prepared." "I understand." He never mentioned Paul. She never asked. Professional responsibilities remained separate from personal disappointment. That separation had always protected the trust from emotional decision-making. After ending the call, Christina opened a secure laptop stored inside a locked cabinet. Encrypted documents awaited her review. Funding reports, performance summaries, compliance schedules, board certifications. Everything appeared orderly. Yet one section quietly caught her attention. Projected expansion financing depended upon continued compliance with fiduciary standards outlined in the original trust agreements. Christina read the paragraph twice, then a third time. The language was neither threatening nor unusual. It merely stated that future financial support remained contingent upon accurate governance, ethical reporting, and fulfillment of contractual obligations. The clause had existed for years. She remembered approving it herself after extensive discussion with Victoria Bennett. At the time, it seemed like ordinary legal protection. Now it felt unexpectedly significant. She closed the file. Not because she feared what it contained, because the review belonged to procedure, not emotion. The next afternoon, Paul returned home unusually early. For nearly 2 hours, the house felt almost familiar again. He held Ethan. He made Grace laugh by gently tapping her tiny nose. Christina watched quietly from the kitchen while preparing dinner. For a moment she saw traces of the man she had married. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. "I'm sorry." She nodded. "You should answer." "It'll only take a minute." The conversation lasted 43 minutes. When he returned, his expression had already changed. "I have to fly to Chicago tonight. The twins enjoyed seeing you." "I know. I'll tell them you stopped by." Paul smiled weakly. "They won't remember." Christina looked toward the nursery. "No," she spoke softly. "They won't. But someday they'll ask." Paul frowned slightly. "Ask what?" "What their first months were like." He gave no answer. Within 20 minutes, he was gone. That night, after feeding Grace at nearly 3 in the morning, Christina wrote another entry inside her notebook. Not because she wanted proof against her husband, because memory becomes unreliable when every day begins to resemble the last. Across the country, Paul stood before investors inside a luxury hotel ballroom. Applause filled the room after he finished describing his company's extraordinary momentum. He thanked executives. He thanked partners. He thanked financial institutions. He thanked anonymous supporters whose confidence had made impossible growth achievable. He never wondered who those anonymous supporters actually were. He believed success belonged entirely to those standing beneath the stage lights. Far away, Daniel Harper reviewed the same financial reports from a different perspective. Numbers rarely carried emotion, but they always revealed dependence. And the deeper he examined the company's expansion, the clearer one truth became. Paul had spent years building an empire without ever asking who had quietly laid its foundation. Monday mornings inside Harrison Development Group always began with confidence. The company's headquarters occupied 32 floors of a glass tower overlooking downtown Chicago, where polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and carefully curated artwork projected an image of relentless success. Employees moved quickly through bright corridors carrying tablets, financial reports, and cups of coffee as television screens displayed interviews praising the firm's latest expansion. For most people walking through the lobby, Harrison Development looked unstoppable. Paul enjoyed that impression. He stepped from the elevator wearing a tailored navy suit, greeting employees with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed every important decision ultimately belonged to him. "Good morning." "Morning, Mr. Harrison." "The Denver presentation is ready." "Excellent." The Atlanta acquisition documents arrived. "I'll review them after the board meeting." Everything appeared exactly as it should, at least on the surface. Inside the executive conference room, however, the atmosphere felt noticeably different. Richard Coleman, the chairman of the board, sat quietly reviewing several financial summaries before the meeting officially began. At 68, Richard had spent 4 decades building companies surviving recessions, acquisitions, and more than one corporate scandal that had destroyed competitors less disciplined than his own organizations. He had learned that prosperity often concealed the earliest signs of danger. Olivia Sanders, the company's chief financial officer, entered, carrying a thick folder filled with revised cash flow projections. Unlike Paul, Olivia celebrated numbers rather than headlines. She trusted audited statements more than optimistic forecasts and preferred uncomfortable facts over reassuring assumptions. Thomas Reed, corporate legal counsel, followed a moment later, with several marked contracts under one arm. He rarely spoke unless necessary. When he did, experienced executives listened carefully. Paul entered last. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with an easy smile, "let's discuss our next chapter." Richard returned the smile politely. "I hope that's exactly what we're doing." The meeting began with familiar reports. Construction timelines remained on schedule. Investor confidence remained high. Media coverage continued generating positive attention. Regional expansion exceeded expectations. Everything appeared impressive. Then Olivia opened her folder. "There is one matter I'd like to revisit." Paul leaned back comfortably. "Go ahead." "Our liquidity projections for the next 18 months. They're already funded. Mostly." Paul noticed the single word immediately. Mostly. Olivia slid several spreadsheets across the table. "Our current expansion depends upon scheduled capital distributions through multiple institutional investment vehicles." Paul glanced briefly at the documents. "That's been true for years." "Yes. So, what's changed?" Olivia folded her hands. "Nothing yet." Richard looked up from his notes. "Yet is an important word." Olivia nodded. "The funding itself isn't the concern." "What is?" "The complexity." Paul frowned. "I don't follow." "The money supporting our largest projects doesn't come directly from conventional lenders." "We've always known that." "Yes. But the underlying investment structure has become increasingly interconnected." Thomas finally spoke. "She's correct." Paul turned toward him. "You've reviewed everything." "I have." "And," Thomas carefully chose every word, "legally speaking, our financing remains compliant." "Then where's the problem?" "There isn't one." Paul smiled. "Exactly." Thomas continued before anyone else could respond. "There isn't one today." The room became quiet. Paul disliked conditional answers. Richard broke the silence. "Explain." Thomas opened one of his folders. Several funding vehicles ultimately trace back through charitable investment partnerships. Paul shrugged. "So, those partnerships contain governance provisions. We've always satisfied them." Thomas nodded. "As far as we know." "As far as we know," Olivia answered this time, "the documentation is unusually layered." Paul laughed lightly. "You're making perfectly ordinary financing sound mysterious." "No," Olivia replied calmly. "I'm saying we should understand every dependency before committing to another $1 billion in expansion." Richard slowly closed his notebook. "I agree." Paul looked from one executive to another. "We've received every scheduled distribution on time." "Correct." "Our investors are happy." "Correct." "Our projects are profitable." "Correct." "So why are we creating unnecessary anxiety?" Nobody answered immediately. Experience had taught Richard that confidence often became most dangerous when it discouraged curiosity. Several states away, Christina sat in the sunroom of her home, with Ethan sleeping peacefully across her lap. Grace rested inside a bassinet nearby, occasionally stretching tiny hands toward the colorful mobile hanging overhead. The house felt wonderfully quiet. For the first time in days, both babies had fallen asleep simultaneously. Christina used those precious moments carefully. She opened a secure tablet connected to the Lewis Family Trust's encrypted communication system. A notification appeared. Quarterly Trustee Governance Meeting. Attendance required. She adjusted Ethan gently before joining the video conference. One by one, familiar faces appeared on the screen. Daniel Harper, Victoria Bennett, 3 regional trustees, 2 investment advisors, an independent compliance specialist. No one wasted time with unnecessary conversation. Daniel began immediately. "Good afternoon, everyone." After brief greetings, charts replaced faces on the screen. Performance summaries, community grant distributions, hospital construction updates, scholarship expansion, disaster relief allocations. The Lewis Family Trust continued supporting thousands of families across the country without attracting significant public attention. That had always been its purpose. Only after nearly 40 minutes did Daniel arrive at the final agenda item. Corporate investment oversight. Several new reports appeared, Christina recognized Harrison Development immediately. Daniel spoke evenly. Our annual review includes all major institutional partnerships. He highlighted several financial diagrams. As expected, Harrison Development continues receiving indirect capital through multiple investment entities. One trustee asked, "Any concerns?" Daniel answered honestly, "None at this stage." Another advisor added, "Performance exceeds projections." Victoria then spoke. However, all beneficiaries remain subject to standard governance verification. Christina read silently while scrolling through supporting documents. Every page reflected routine procedure. Nothing suggested misconduct. Nothing recommended intervention. Everything simply followed established policy. Daniel looked toward the camera. "Chair Lewis." Christina raised her eyes. "Yes." "Do you have any questions?" She considered the reports carefully. "No." "Any requested modifications?" "No." Victoria smiled faintly. "Then we'll continue according to normal review procedures." Christina nodded. "Please do." One trustee laughed softly. "You always make these meetings shorter." Christina smiled politely. "I don't believe in changing systems that already protect everyone equally." Daniel appreciated the answer. That principle explained why she had earned unanimous confidence from every trustee, despite becoming chair at a relatively young age. Personal relationships never influenced her professional decisions. The meeting continued another 20 minutes before concluding. After everyone disconnected except Daniel, he remained on the screen. "You look tired." The twins discovered they enjoy alternating sleep schedules. Daniel smiled. "I remember those years." "You survived." "Barely." For a moment they spoke not as trustee and chairwoman, but as two people who had known each other for nearly 2 decades. Finally, Daniel became serious. "I want to mention one thing." Christina listened. "Our compliance department requested additional documentation from several corporate beneficiaries." "Routine." "Entirely." She nodded. "Good. I thought you'd appreciate hearing it directly, rather than reading formal notices later." "Thank you." He hesitated. "How's Paul?" Christina looked toward the nursery door. "Busy." "I've noticed." She understood what he meant. Business magazines, television interviews, conference appearances. Paul's public profile had grown dramatically over the past year. Daniel continued carefully. "I hope success hasn't made life more difficult." Christina answered after a brief pause. "Success reveals priorities." Daniel said nothing. There was little to add. He had spent enough years observing people in positions of influence to recognize that wealth rarely changed character. More often, it removed the reasons people once hid it. That evening, Paul returned home earlier than expected. He found Christina sitting on the living room floor between the twins' playmats. Grace laughed as Ethan unsuccessfully tried reaching a soft, stuffed elephant just beyond his fingertips. For several seconds, Paul simply watched. "They're getting bigger." Christina smiled. "They are." He crouched beside Ethan. "I missed a lot this month." She looked at him quietly. "There will be more moments." "I know." "I hope so." Paul reached for Grace, who wrapped her tiny fingers around one of his. His expression softened. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "Once this expansion finishes, everything will settle down." Christina had heard similar promises before. Still, she answered gently, "I hope it does." His phone vibrated. He sighed before checking the screen. "Richard Coleman." Paul answered immediately. "Richard?" Richard's voice remained composed. "We need to schedule an additional board session." Tomorrow, if possible. What's happened? Nothing alarming. Paul relaxed slightly. Then why the urgency? We're conducting a broader review of our funding structures. Paul laughed. Olivia again. Olivia and Thomas. They're worrying too much. Perhaps. Richard paused, but I'd rather answer unnecessary questions today than unavoidable ones tomorrow. After the call ended, Paul slipped the phone back into his pocket. Business? Christina asked. He nodded. Just routine. She looked at him for a long moment. Routine has a way of becoming important. Paul smiled without understanding what she meant. Neither of them realized that hundreds of miles away, with teams of accountants, attorneys, and compliance specialists, had already begun reviewing documents that connected their two worlds far more closely than Paul had ever imagined. And every page they examined brought them one step closer to a truth no amount of confidence could postpone. Autumn arrived quietly. The maple trees lining Christina and Paul's neighborhood shifted from deep green to brilliant shades of amber and crimson, while cool morning air drifted through the windows each time Christina opened them after sunrise. Inside the house, however, the seasons were measured differently. Not by leaves, not by temperature, but by Ethan and Grace. Every few weeks they discovered something new. Ethan had learned to recognize Christina's voice before she entered the room. Even when he could not see her, his restless movements settled the moment she spoke his name. Grace had become fascinated with faces. She studied every expression with remarkable concentration before rewarding the smallest smile with one of her own. Their personalities continued unfolding day after day. Christina witnessed every change. Paul heard about most of them afterward. One Saturday morning, Ethan rolled onto his stomach for the first time. Christina clapped softly, laughing as he looked around with obvious surprise at his own accomplishment. "That's my brave boy." Grace responded by kicking both legs, enthusiastically determined not to be outdone by her brother. Christina reached for her phone, not to post the moment online, only to record it for their family. She sent Paul a short video with a simple message. "Ethan rolled over today. Grace is trying to copy him. We miss you." The message showed as delivered within seconds. It remained unread for nearly 6 hours. Finally, a reply appeared. "Amazing. Tell them Daddy is proud. Busy meeting. Love you." Christina looked at the screen for several moments before placing the phone face down. She whispered toward the nursery. "I'll tell them myself." The following Wednesday, the twins had another pediatric appointment. Paul had promised 3 weeks earlier that nothing would prevent him from attending. "I already blocked my calendar," he had assured Christina. "I'll be there." She believed him. At 9:15 that morning, just as Christina secured Grace into her car seat, her phone vibrated. "Paul, I'm so sorry." She closed her eyes briefly. "What happened?" "An investor delegation arrived unexpectedly." "I see. I tried moving the meeting." "You don't have to explain. I'll make the next appointment." Christina glanced at Ethan, who had already fallen asleep inside his stroller. "The appointment is at 10. "I know. I'll tell the doctor you couldn't come. I'm really sorry." "I know." She ended the call gently, not because she felt peaceful, because there was nothing left to discuss. The pediatric visit lasted nearly an hour. Both babies were healthy. Their weight had increased steadily. Development remained ahead of expectations. The doctor smiled warmly. "They're doing wonderfully." Christina thanked her. As they prepared to leave, another couple entered the waiting room carrying their own infant. The father balanced the diaper bag over one shoulder while making funny faces that sent his daughter into delighted laughter. The mother leaned comfortably against him. For only a moment, Christina watched them, not with envy, simply with quiet curiosity. She wondered whether ordinary family mornings always looked that effortless. Outside the clinic, she loaded Ethan and Grace into the car before opening her notebook. Appointment completed. Paul absent. Reason given investor meeting. No emotion. Only another fact. By early November, Paul's schedule had become almost impossible to follow. Chicago, Dallas, Seattle, Boston, New York. He moved from airport to airport with remarkable efficiency, speaking at conferences where audiences applauded every presentation about Harrison Development's unprecedented growth. Business magazines described him as one of the country's fastest-rising executives. Financial podcasts praised his strategic vision. Television anchors introduced him as an example of modern corporate leadership. Every interview included polished answers. My family keeps me grounded. I never forget what truly matters. Success means nothing without the people waiting for you at home. Christina happened to hear one interview while folding baby clothes. She neither laughed nor cried. She simply lowered the volume. Grace looked up from her blanket. "Too loud?" Christina asked softly. Grace answered with a tiny smile. Meanwhile, another voice increasingly influenced Paul's thinking. His mother. Linda Brooks had always admired ambition. She believed financial success solved nearly every problem worth solving. Whenever Paul questioned whether he was spending enough time at home, Linda offered immediate reassurance. "You have responsibilities." "I know. Children won't remember these early months." Paul hesitated. "Christina seems disappointed." Linda dismissed the concern with a wave of her hand. "She's emotional because she's exhausted." "Maybe. Every successful man sacrifices something." Paul stared through the restaurant window. "I just don't want to lose my family." Linda smiled confidently. "You won't. How can you be sure?" "Because you're building security for them." She leaned forward. "When Ethan and Grace grow up, they'll thank you for everything you've achieved." Paul wanted to believe her. The conversation comforted him far more than it should have. Across town, Christina received an unexpected visitor. Margaret Lewis arrived, carrying homemade soup, despite insisting she was too old to cook complicated meals anymore. "You've lost weight," Margaret observed gently. "I've been chasing 2 tiny supervisors." Margaret laughed. "I imagine they demand impossible hours." "They're very strict." The twins seemed delighted by their great-grandmother. Grace immediately reached toward Margaret's necklace while Ethan fell asleep in her arms within minutes. Margaret looked around the quiet living room. "Where's Paul?" "Boston." "He travels often?" "Yes." Margaret said nothing further. Instead, she watched Christina prepare bottles with practiced efficiency. Every movement reflected routine. Everything had its place. Bottles sterilized, laundry folded, medical supplies organized, calendars updated, notebook resting neatly beside the kitchen counter. Margaret noticed it. "You still write everything down?" "It helps. About the babies." "Mostly." "Mostly," Christina smiled faintly. "I like remembering life accurately." Margaret understood. Years of leading one of the country's largest charitable trusts had taught her that written facts often became far more valuable than emotional memories. She did not ask another question. Later that afternoon, Daniel Harper called. "I hope your grandmother arrived safely." "She did." "Good." He paused. "I wanted to update you." Christina immediately recognized his professional tone. "The compliance reviews." "Progressing normally." "And Harrison Development." Daniel opened a folder before answering. "Our analysts requested several additional governance certifications. Anything unusual? No conclusions yet. But there are inconsistencies requiring clarification. Christina remained silent. Daniel continued. We're simply following procedure. I understand. You don't seem surprised. I've learned something recently. What? Small patterns eventually become large ones. Daniel smiled to himself. Your grandmother used to say exactly that. She was usually right. After ending the call, Christina returned to feeding Ethan. She never asked Daniel to accelerate the investigation. She never suggested additional scrutiny. Rules existed precisely to prevent personal relationships from influencing professional judgment. If Harrison Development satisfied every requirement, the review would end quietly. If it did not, the consequences would come from policy, not from Christina. That distinction mattered deeply to her. Several days later, Harrison Development hosted its annual executive gala. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom, while journalists interviewed senior leadership before dinner. Paul stood confidently beneath bright lights discussing future expansion. Our momentum has never been stronger. Applause followed. Across the ballroom, Olivia Sanders listened without smiling. She had spent the afternoon reviewing revised financial models. The numbers still worked. Barely. Too many projections depended upon assumptions outside direct corporate control. Thomas Reed quietly joined her. You look concerned. I am. Still thinking about the trust-backed financing. I'm thinking about dependency. Thomas nodded. They're related. Olivia lowered her voice. Have you ever wondered who actually controls those trusts? Thomas looked toward Paul, now posing for photographs. Frequently. And I've never found a complete answer. Neither of them noticed Richard Coleman watching from across the room. Richard had spent enough years in boardrooms to recognize one unmistakable truth. When both the chief financial officer and chief legal counsel independently begin asking the same question, wise leaders investigate before circumstances force them to. Late that night, Paul returned home after midnight. The house was dark, except for a small lamp glowing beside the nursery door. He stepped quietly inside. Ethan and Grace slept peacefully. Christina had fallen asleep in a rocking chair, one hand resting gently on each crib, as though protecting both children, even in her dreams. Paul stood there longer than usual. For the first time in months, the silence around him felt heavier than applause. He wanted to wake Christina. He wanted to promise that things would change. Instead, he covered her shoulders with a blanket, looked once more at the twins, and quietly walked away. Behind him, the notebook remained open on the nearby table. Its newest entry contained only one short sentence. The children are growing faster than promises. Paul never saw it. Winter settled over Chicago with quiet determination. Snow covered the sidewalks outside Harrison Development's headquarters, softening the city's sharp edges while commuters hurried beneath gray skies. From the executive floor, however, the weather seemed almost irrelevant. Inside the conference rooms, conversations revolved around acquisitions, capital allocations, expansion schedules, and shareholder expectations. For Paul, every new day represented another opportunity to move the company forward. For someone else, it represented the beginning of a careful review. On a Tuesday morning, Daniel Harper arrived at the Lewis Family Trust's headquarters shortly before 7. The building reflected the philosophy of the institution it housed. There were no extravagant marble sculptures, no oversized corporate logos, no displays celebrating wealth. Instead, photographs lined the walls, showing schools built in rural communities, children's hospitals, veterans' rehabilitation centers, public libraries, and disaster relief projects funded quietly over decades. Every reminder pointed toward service rather than prestige. Daniel entered the main conference room carrying 3 organized folders. Waiting inside were Victoria Bennett, 2 senior compliance officers, several investment analysts, and Michael Carter. Michael had earned a national reputation as one of the country's most respected independent forensic financial auditors. He possessed an unusual ability to recognize patterns that escaped ordinary accounting reviews. He rarely reached conclusions quickly. He preferred evidence to instinct. Daniel greeted everyone before taking his seat. "Thank you for coming." Michael opened his notebook. "You mentioned a governance review." Daniel nodded. "Our annual review identified several institutional relationships requiring expanded verification." "Any allegations?" "None." "Complaints?" "None." "Whistleblower reports?" "No." Michael appreciated the answer. "So this remains a routine compliance examination?" "Exactly." Daniel placed a folder before him. Harrison Development. Michael scanned the cover page. Rapid growth? Very. Large capital requirements? Yes. Long-term institutional financing? Daniel smiled slightly. "You've already noticed the important questions." Michael looked up. "Growth itself never worries me." "What does, when growth begins assuming tomorrow will always resemble yesterday?" The room became quiet. That sentence summarized years of professional experience. Daniel continued. "The trust has significant indirect exposure through multiple investment partnerships." Michael nodded slowly. "I'll begin with documentation. No deadlines. I prefer that. Accuracy matters more than speed." Meanwhile, inside Harrison Development, Olivia Sanders stood alone in her office reviewing quarterly projections. She had spent most of the previous evening comparing cash flow schedules with financing commitments. Something continued bothering her. Every calculation balanced. Every contract appeared valid. Yet the structure supporting those numbers seemed unusually dependent upon a relatively small network of institutional partnerships. She opened another spreadsheet, then another. The names changed. The entities changed. The investment vehicles changed. But eventually, the same connections repeatedly appeared beneath layers of corporate structure. Charitable investment partnerships, educational endowments, community development funds, private institutional trusts. Individually, nothing seemed unusual. Collectively, they represented an enormous portion of Harrison Development's long-term stability. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Thomas Reed stepped inside. "You've been here since 6. I couldn't stop thinking. About liquidity. About dependency." Thomas closed the office door. "I spent half the night reviewing governance language." "And," he handed her several highlighted pages. "Read section 14. Olivia adjusted her glasses. "Continued participation remains subject to periodic fiduciary compliance verification." She looked up. "That's standard." "Keep reading," she continued. "Institutional beneficiaries shall maintain governance practices consistent with representations provided during funding approval." She frowned. "Still standard." Thomas nodded. "Until someone decides to verify it." Olivia placed the papers on her desk. "Do you believe we're at risk?" "I don't know." "I dislike that answer." "So do I." Before either could continue, Paul's voice echoed from the hallway. "There you are." He entered carrying obvious enthusiasm. "I've got good news." Olivia forced a smile. "We could use some. The Phoenix acquisition is almost finalized." Thomas remained thoughtful. "Congratulations." Paul noticed neither of them appeared particularly excited. "What's wrong?" Olivia answered honestly. We're reviewing financing structures. You've been reviewing them for weeks. Because they're complicated. Paul laughed. Complicated doesn't mean dangerous, Thomas responded carefully. No. But complicated deserves understanding. Paul waved dismissively. We've never missed a funding commitment. Correct. Our lenders are satisfied. Yes. Our investors are happy. For now. Paul paused. What does that mean? Olivia folded her hands. It means I want to understand every source supporting our future obligations. Paul shook his head. You worry too much. She met his eyes calmly. That's my job. Across town, Christina sat in the living room while Ethan crawled determinedly toward a stack of colorful blocks. Grace watched from a blanket nearby before deciding she wanted the same toy at exactly the same moment. Within seconds, both babies reached for the identical block. Christina smiled. So, this is how negotiations begin. Neither child seemed interested in compromise. Eventually, Ethan surrendered the toy voluntarily and reached for another. Grace immediately became fascinated by the second one instead. Christina laughed quietly. Perhaps diplomacy takes practice. Her phone vibrated. Daniel. She answered softly so the twins would not become distracted. Good morning. I wanted to keep you informed. I'm listening. We've expanded the annual governance review. Routine. Entirely. Who will conduct it? Michael Carter. Christina nodded. He has an excellent reputation. He does. Daniel hesitated. I wanted you to hear it directly. Thank you. There will likely be additional document requests. I'll approve whatever standard procedures require. As always. Neither mentioned Paul. Neither needed to. Professional boundaries remained intact. After ending the call, Christina returned to playing with Ethan and Grace. She never wondered whether Michael would discover anything. If policies had been respected, the review would confirm exactly that. If not, the documents would reveal their own story. Late that afternoon, Michael Carter began examining Harrison Development's financial history. He approached the task without assumptions. Acquisition records, board resolutions, funding schedules, capital distributions, bank transfers, executive certifications. Every document entered a growing timeline spread across his office table. Hours passed unnoticed. One pattern gradually became impossible to ignore. Nearly every major expansion corresponded with funding originating from institutional partnerships connected directly or indirectly to the same network of charitable investment structures. Michael circled several entries. Interesting, not suspicious, simply important. He requested additional documentation. No accusations accompanied the request, only professional curiosity. The following morning, Richard Coleman received notification that several routine governance certifications required updating. He forwarded the message to Thomas. Anything unusual? Thomas read carefully. No. Then why do I feel uncomfortable? Thomas smiled faintly. Because experienced chairmen recognize that paperwork usually arrives before problems do. Richard appreciated the observation. I've survived enough boardrooms to know that's true. Later that day, Paul joined Richard for lunch. The restaurant overlooked the Chicago River where chunks of drifting ice moved slowly beneath steel bridges. Paul remained optimistic. The Phoenix acquisition will redefine this company. Richard stirred his coffee thoughtfully. It may. You don't sound convinced. I'm cautious. We're stronger than ever. Richard looked out the window. Tell me something. What? If someone asked you today where every dollar supporting our expansion ultimately originated? Paul smiled confidently. I'd say from years of smart decisions. Richard turned back toward him. I didn't ask about decisions. Paul hesitated. I trust our finance team. So do I. I trust legal. So do I. Richard folded his hands. But trust isn't the same as understanding. Paul shrugged. Do we really need to understand every institutional investor? No. Richard's voice remained calm. But we should understand every institution capable of changing our future. Paul considered the statement only briefly before dismissing it. We're overthinking success. Richard chose not to argue. Experience had taught him another lesson. Some people accepted warnings only after consequences arrived. That evening, Christina prepared dinner, while Ethan and Grace sat in high chairs enthusiastically experimenting with mashed sweet potatoes. More food reached their faces than their mouths. Christina laughed as Grace somehow managed to smear orange puree across her own forehead. You've invented a new hairstyle, the twins giggled. Their happiness filled the house. For several peaceful minutes, nothing else seemed important. Then the evening news began playing softly from the television in the adjacent room. Paul appeared on the screen during a business interview. The reporter smiled. Many analysts say Harrison Development's growth seems unstoppable. Paul answered confidently. We've built a foundation that will support expansion for many years. Christina looked toward the television, then toward her children. She switched the television off, not because she disagreed, but because Ethan had started laughing again, and that sound deserved the room more than applause from strangers. Several miles away, Michael Carter remained alone inside his office. One final document had just arrived. It contained executive certifications submitted years earlier during one of Harrison Development's earliest funding approvals. He compared signatures, dates, supporting resolutions. Everything appeared complete. Yet one handwritten note attached to an archived trustee memorandum caught his attention. It was only a single sentence. Future funding subject to continuing governance verification by controlling trustee. Michael leaned back slowly. The review had just become far more significant than anyone at Harrison Development yet realized. And somewhere beyond layers of confidential legal records, the name of that controlling trustee waited patiently to be discovered. By early spring, Harrison Development had become one of the most talked-about companies in the commercial real estate industry. Business journals praised its aggressive expansion. Financial television networks debated whether the company could become one of the nation's dominant developers within the decade. Industry conferences competed to feature Paul as a keynote speaker. His calendar reflected that growing reputation. Breakfast with investors, lunch with city officials, afternoon interviews, evening fundraising galas, late-night strategy sessions. Every hour seemed assigned before the previous one had ended. To Paul, the attention felt deserved. Years of relentless work had produced visible results. He rarely considered how many unseen decisions had quietly supported his success. Inside the company's marketing department, preparations were underway for another announcement. The Phoenix acquisition had been finalized. The executive team planned to introduce an ambitious nationwide development initiative involving affordable housing, mixed-use commercial districts, and community infrastructure. Publicly, the project represented confidence. Privately, it represented extraordinary financial commitment. Richard Coleman reviewed the presentation one final time. The slides looked impressive. Projected growth curves climbed steadily upward. Revenue forecasts exceeded previous expectations. Investor participation remained strong. Still, Richard found himself pausing at one page longer than the others. Capital stability. The numbers were excellent. Perhaps too excellent. He walked down the hallway toward Olivia Sanders' office. She was already reviewing revised funding schedules. "I was hoping to find you." Olivia looked up. "I assume this isn't a social visit?" Richard smiled faintly. "Not exactly." He placed the presentation on her desk. "Tell me honestly, what do you want to know? Are these projections realistic?" She considered the question carefully. "They're possible." "That's different." "Yes." Richard sat across from her. "What concerns you most?" Olivia leaned back. "I've spent months tracing our financing structure. And I understand almost all of it." "Almost?" "There are still institutional relationships extending beyond ordinary corporate lending." Richard nodded. "The charitable partnerships." "Exactly. They've always supported us." "They have." "So why worry now?" Olivia turned her monitor toward him. Several charts appeared. Colored lines connected investment partnerships, community development funds, educational endowments, charitable foundations, and private institutional trusts. At first glance, the diagram looked impossibly complicated. Then Olivia highlighted one section. "Everything eventually converges here." Richard studied the screen. "Interesting. What do you notice?" He frowned. "I don't recognize the controlling entity." "Neither did I." "You've investigated." "For weeks." "And the ownership structure is protected." Richard remained silent. Institutional privacy was not unusual. Complete opacity was. Meanwhile, Thomas Reed sat in his office reading another set of compliance notices received that morning. Nothing within them accused Harrison Development of wrongdoing. Nothing suggested immediate legal exposure. Yet each request sought additional verification. Board certifications, governance acknowledgments, executive disclosures, routine documents. Thomas understood something many executives overlooked. Routine paperwork became significant only when someone intended to compare it with other records. He picked up the phone. "Paul, do you have a minute?" "For you, sure." "My office." 5 minutes later, Paul entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I brought one for you." Thomas accepted it gratefully. "I appreciate that." "So, what's happening?" Thomas spread several documents across his desk. "We've received another round of compliance requests." Paul sighed. "Again?" "Yes. They're becoming excessive. They're becoming thorough." Paul looked unconcerned. "Complete whatever they need." "I intend to." Thomas paused. "But I recommend we review every executive certification personally." Paul laughed lightly. "You sound like we're preparing for trial." "We're preparing for verification." "Same difference." "No." Thomas met Paul's eyes. "Verification rewards accuracy." The conversation ended there. Paul still believed the legal department worried far more than necessary. Hundreds of miles away, Christina spent the afternoon pushing Ethan and Grace through a neighborhood park. The twins had become fascinated with birds. Every squirrel, duck, or robin seemed worthy of complete attention. Grace pointed excitedly whenever pigeons landed nearby. Ethan watched quietly before smiling at almost everything he saw. The simplicity of their wonder calmed Christina. Children measured success differently than adults. A warm breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers through the park. For the first time in months, Christina allowed herself to slow down. Her phone rang. Daniel Harper. "Beautiful afternoon," he said after she answered. "It is." "I'll keep this brief." "I'm listening." "The expanded governance review continues." "Any developments?" "Nothing conclusive." She appreciated his precision. But several institutions requested additional documentation from Harrison Development. Routine. Entirely. Christina watched Grace laugh at a butterfly drifting past the stroller. I'm glad procedures are being followed. Daniel smiled to himself. You always say that? Because it's always true. He hesitated. I've also received several requests asking who currently serves as controlling trustee. Christina remained quiet. And your response? The same as always. Confidential. Until disclosure becomes legally required. Good. Daniel understood why. The trust had never existed to enhance anyone's personal reputation. Confidentiality protected both the institution and its beneficiaries. No one received special treatment. No one received advance warning. The rules remained identical regardless of names or relationships. After ending the call, Christina continued walking. Ethan reached toward the sky as sunlight filtered through tree branches above him. Grace had fallen asleep. Christina smiled. Some moments deserved complete attention. Not every silence required filling. At nearly the same hour, Michael Carter spread dozens of folders across the large conference table inside his temporary audit office. Forensic accounting often resembled assembling an enormous puzzle. Individual documents rarely revealed much. Patterns emerged only after enough pieces occupied the same table. He arranged materials chronologically. Original investment approvals, executive certifications, capital distributions, annual governance reports, supplemental agreements, bank confirmations. Everything appeared orderly. Then he noticed another recurring detail. Every major funding authorization ultimately referenced continuing governance eligibility, certified by a controlling trustee. The wording never changed. The trustee's identity never appeared. Michael requested another archived file. Minutes later, an assistant delivered several sealed records. He opened them carefully. Inside lay decades of trustee succession documentation. Most names had long since retired. One succession remained partially redacted. Only the effective date remained visible. Michael studied it. The transition had occurred several years before Harrison Development's rapid expansion began. Coincidence, perhaps. He wrote another note. Verify succession authority. Back at Harrison Development, preparations for the national announcement accelerated. Large digital displays arrived. Media invitations were distributed. Investors confirmed attendance. Public relations teams rehearsed every presentation. Paul stood on the stage inside the company's auditorium, watching technicians adjust lighting. Richard joined him. Nervous, Paul smiled confidently. Excited, Richard looked around the empty room. Tomorrow this place will be full. I know. You've built something remarkable. Paul appreciated the compliment. Thank you. Richard continued quietly. Just remember. What? Strong companies celebrate success. And wise companies prepare for questions. Paul laughed. You're starting to sound like Thomas. And Olivia. They're both too cautious. Richard didn't argue. Instead, he looked toward the rows of empty seats, soon to be occupied by investors, journalists, government officials, and business leaders. He had attended enough corporate celebrations to recognize a familiar truth. The louder the applause, the more important it became to verify the foundation beneath the stage. That evening, Christina tucked Ethan and Grace into their cribs before opening the leather notebook she had maintained since the twins were born. She no longer wrote every missed feeding or canceled dinner. The pattern had become too consistent. Instead, she recorded moments that mattered. Grace laughed for nearly 5 minutes while chasing bubbles. Ethan took 3 unsupported steps before falling into my arms. Both children fell asleep holding the same stuffed elephant. She closed the notebook gently. Life continued moving forward whether someone witnessed every milestone or not. Nearby on her secure laptop, another notification quietly appeared. Trust Compliance Review. Phase 2 authorized. Christina opened the message. Only one sentence required her attention. Standard governance verification will proceed according to established policy. Below it appeared 2 buttons. Approve. Request revision. She selected Approve without hesitation. No additional comments, no special instructions, no exceptions. The system confirmed her authorization. Miles away, Michael Carter received the automatic notification. Phase 2 had officially begun. For the first time since opening the review, institutional investigators now possessed authority to compare executive representations with underlying financial documentation in full. The process remained entirely confidential. No one at Harrison Development had yet realized that ordinary paperwork had quietly crossed into a far more comprehensive examination. Least of all Paul, who ended the evening rehearsing tomorrow's speech about certainty growth and the bright future he believed no one could interrupt. The national expansion announcement began exactly at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning. Television crews positioned cameras along the back wall of Harrison Development's auditorium, while reporters arranged notebooks across reserved tables near the stage. Representatives from investment firms, commercial banks, city planning agencies, and construction partners filled nearly every seat. A massive screen displayed the company's newest slogan, "Building Tomorrow Together." Soft music faded as Paul stepped confidently toward the podium. The applause was immediate. He paused long enough to acknowledge the audience before beginning. "Thank you for being here today." His voice carried the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to speaking before large crowds. 5 years ago, our company dreamed of expanding beyond regional projects. Today, because of extraordinary partners, dedicated employees, and unwavering confidence in our vision, Harrison Development is entering the most ambitious chapter in its history. Another round of applause followed. Slides appeared behind him. New housing developments, commercial districts, medical office complexes, mixed-use neighborhoods, projected job creation, economic impact estimates. Everything looked polished. Everything suggested certainty. Near the front row, Richard Coleman listened carefully. He had reviewed the presentation several times, yet one sentence continued echoing in his thoughts. Unwavering confidence. Confidence was valuable. Verification was indispensable. Olivia Sanders sat only a few seats away. She applauded politely whenever expected, but her attention remained fixed on her tablet resting quietly on her lap. Several financial dashboards updated automatically throughout the presentation. Nothing unusual appeared, until her screen refreshed again. A new notification appeared across the top. Institutional documentation request received. She frowned. Another one. She opened the secure message. Routine governance verification. Required response within 10 business days. Requested documents, executive governance certifications, updated board resolutions, institutional compliance acknowledgments, verification of fiduciary representations. Everything sounded ordinary. Yet this marked the 4th request received within 6 weeks. She made a note to discuss it with Thomas immediately after the event. On stage, Paul continued enthusiastically. "Our success has always rested upon strong relationships." The audience nodded approvingly. He smiled. "And those relationships will carry us even further." Hundreds of miles away inside the Lewis Family Trust headquarters, Daniel Harper watched a much quieter presentation. There were no cameras, no applause, only long conference tables, financial analysts, compliance officers, attorneys, and stacks of carefully organized documents. Michael Carter stood before a digital display showing Harrison Development's institutional funding structure. Colored lines stretched across the screen like branches of an enormous tree. Michael spoke calmly. The purpose of this review remains unchanged. No one interrupted. We are not investigating allegations. He clicked to the next slide. We are verifying governance compliance. Another slide appeared. Funding pathways, investment partnerships, trust-backed capital distributions, charitable development allocations. Michael continued. Our preliminary review confirms that Harrison Development has benefited from multiple independent funding vehicles. One analyst asked quietly, "Any irregularities?" Michael answered precisely. "None established." "Any concerns?" "There are questions." Daniel appreciated the distinction. Questions invited evidence. Conclusions required it. Michael enlarged one section of the chart. This institutional network ultimately depends upon continuing certification by a controlling trustee. Several analysts nodded. That clause had appeared repeatedly. One compliance officer asked, "Identity confirmed?" Daniel answered, "Confidential." Michael simply added another note. Verification continues. Back in Chicago, reporters crowded around Paul immediately after the presentation concluded. "Mr. Harrison, what makes you so confident about continued expansion?" Paul smiled comfortably. "Our financial foundation has never been stronger." Another reporter asked, "Some analysts describe your institutional financing as unusually diversified." "We're fortunate to have long-term partners who believe in responsible growth." "Were you surprised by recent compliance reviews?" Paul answered without hesitation. "Not at all. Routine. Entirely." He believed every word. Across the room, Thomas Reed overheard the exchange. Routine, yes, but routine processes sometimes uncovered extraordinary truths. As journalists dispersed, Olivia approached him. "Did you receive another request?" Thomas nodded. "This morning. So did finance. They're synchronized." She lowered her voice. "That bothers me." "It should." Paul joined them, carrying obvious excitement. The media loved it. Olivia forced a smile. "Congratulations. We'll probably dominate tomorrow's business news." Thomas looked at him carefully. "Before tomorrow arrives, I'd like executive certifications updated." Paul sighed. "Again. Again. We already completed them. Now we'll complete them once more." Paul shook his head with mild amusement. "You lawyers really know how to celebrate." Thomas smiled politely. "We celebrate completed paperwork." That afternoon, Christina sat at her dining table helping Ethan and Grace explore finger paints designed especially for infants. Most of the paint reached the protective paper covering the table. Some reached Ethan's nose. Grace somehow managed to decorate both hands before proudly pressing them against her own bib. Christina laughed. "I think modern art has officially entered this house." Her phone vibrated softly. Victoria Bennett. "Hello, Victoria. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Only a masterpiece." Victoria smiled despite herself. "I'll be brief." "I'm listening." Phase 2 document comparisons have begun. Understood. As expected, several institutional beneficiaries have received standardized verification requests. Christina gently wiped blue paint from Grace's fingers. "Good." Victoria hesitated. "You never ask which organizations." "The policy applies equally." "It does. And that's exactly why it should remain that way." Victoria admired Christina's consistency. Many leaders quietly searched for advantages. Christina consistently avoided them. After ending the call, she washed Ethan's tiny hands while he giggled at the running water. Outside the kitchen window, spring sunlight reflected across the backyard. For several peaceful minutes, nothing existed beyond laughter. Meanwhile, Michael Carter sat surrounded by newly delivered bank documentation. The files occupied nearly half the conference table. Every transfer matched reported financial statements. Every distribution appeared authorized. No missing funds, no hidden accounts, no fraudulent transactions. From a purely accounting perspective, Harrison Development appeared remarkably disciplined. Michael appreciated that. Good governance often produced orderly records. Still, another question remained. Who ultimately possessed authority to continue or discontinue institutional participation? He requested another archive. This time, Victoria Bennett personally delivered the sealed envelope. It contains trustee authorization protocols. Michael accepted it. Anything I should know before opening it? Only that confidentiality remains absolute. He nodded. Understood. After Victoria left, Michael reviewed the contents carefully. Succession procedures, voting records, legal certifications, trustee authority. One document remained heavily protected. Access required dual authorization. Michael closed the folder. He had enough information for now. The review was progressing exactly as procedure intended. Late that evening, Harrison Development's board gathered for a brief executive meeting following the successful announcement. Richard opened the discussion. Excellent presentation today. Several directors nodded. Paul smiled. Thank you. Richard continued. Now for less glamorous matters. Everyone recognized the tone. Olivia distributed updated compliance summaries. Thomas handed out legal correspondence. Richard looked around the table. I want every requested document completed ahead of schedule. One director asked, Is there a problem? No. Then why the urgency? Richard answered honestly. Because thorough preparation has never harmed a well-governed company. Paul leaned back comfortably. I think we're becoming overly cautious. Richard met his gaze. Perhaps. But if routine verification confirms everything we've represented... He paused. Then early preparation costs us nothing. No one argued. The meeting concluded quietly. As executives gathered their papers, Olivia remained behind. Richard noticed. Something else. She looked at the empty conference room. I can't explain it. What? The funding network. Richard waited. The numbers work. Yes. The contracts work. Yes. The legal structure works. Yes. So why do I keep feeling we're only seeing part of the picture? Richard looked toward the dark city skyline beyond the windows. Because sometimes the most important part of a structure isn't visible from the outside. Elsewhere, Christina finished reading Ethan and Grace a bedtime story before carrying them upstairs. She kissed Ethan's forehead, then Grace's. The house settled into familiar silence. Only after both children slept did she unlock her secure laptop. Another notification waited. Governance Comparison Progress Report. Status document matching underway. No action required. She closed the laptop without opening any additional files. Trust existed because procedures worked without constant interference. She trusted the process. Several states away, Michael Carter reached the end of another long day. One final comparison remained before he left. Executive public representations, institutional governance certifications. He placed both folders side by side. The first page aligned perfectly, then another and another, until a small notation on an older certification caused him to stop. Someone had written a single sentence in the margin years earlier. Future participation contingent upon continuing confidence of the controlling trustee. Michael looked thoughtfully at the words, not because they suggested wrongdoing, but because they confirmed something increasingly clear. Harrison Development's remarkable success rested upon confidence granted by someone the company had never truly identified, and confidence, unlike contracts alone, could never be taken for granted. Monday began with an unusual silence inside Harrison Development. The building itself looked no different than it had the week before. Employees still hurried through the lobby carrying coffee cups and laptops. Elevators opened and closed with their usual rhythm. Receptionists greeted visitors with practiced smiles. Yet, on the executive floor, something subtle had changed. No one could point to a single event. No crisis had appeared. No contracts had collapsed. No investors had withdrawn. But questions had begun replacing assumptions. At precisely 8 o'clock, Richard Coleman called an emergency board meeting, not because disaster had struck, because uncertainty deserved attention before it became expensive. When the directors assembled, Richard remained standing instead of taking his seat. "Thank you for coming on short notice." Paul leaned back comfortably. "I assume this is about the compliance reviews." Richard nodded. "It is." Thomas Reed distributed several folders around the table. Each contained updated correspondence from institutional compliance offices. Olivia Sanders projected a financial summary onto the large screen. Richard folded his hands. "I want today's discussion to remain simple." Everyone waited. "We are not responding to accusations." He looked around the room. "We are responding to questions." Paul smiled. "Questions we've already answered." Thomas spoke carefully. "Some." Paul frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means new requests continue arriving." Olivia tapped the screen. 6 additional documentation requests since Thursday. One director raised an eyebrow. 6, Olivia nodded. "They originate from different institutional entities." "Independent, so it appears." Paul looked unconcerned. "Large organizations review documents all the time." Richard agreed. "They do." "So, why are we treating this differently?" Thomas opened one of the folders. "Because the requests aren't identical." Paul reached for the papers. He scanned several pages. Board governance certifications, executive responsibility acknowledgments, historical funding disclosures, institutional compliance statements. Everything looked ordinary. "I still don't see the problem." Thomas pointed toward several highlighted sections. "Notice the references." Paul read them again. "Supporting institutional documentation. Verification of continuing governance compliance. Historical trustee certifications." He looked up. "So," Thomas answered quietly, "they're asking for the same history from different directions." Olivia added, "They're reconstructing something." The room became still. Paul finally sat forward. "What exactly?" Olivia shook her head. "I don't know." Richard spoke. "Neither do I. But I intend to find out before someone else explains it to us." Across the country, Michael Carter had reached the same conclusion. His office looked even more crowded than before. Every available surface held organized stacks of documents, funding agreements, annual reports, bank confirmations, board resolutions, archived trustee memoranda. Large sheets of paper covered one wall. On them, Michael had built a timeline, stretching back nearly 15 years. Colored markers connected significant financial events, acquisitions, capital approvals, expansion phases, institutional certifications, and each connection strengthened a pattern that had become impossible to ignore. Daniel Harper entered quietly. "I thought I'd find you here." Michael smiled, without looking away from the wall. "I've almost finished mapping the institutional relationships." Daniel studied the timeline. "Impressive. It's remarkably consistent. What is the discipline?" Daniel understood immediately. "You expected disorder. I expected growth this rapid to produce inconsistencies. And instead, I found structure." Daniel nodded. "The trust doesn't support carelessness." Michael walked toward another section of the timeline. "However," Daniel smiled slightly, "I've been waiting for that word." Michael pointed to several highlighted entries. "Every major expansion required continuing trustee confidence." Correct. But nowhere inside Harrison Development's executive records do I find evidence that anyone understands who grants that confidence." Daniel remained silent. Michael continued. "They know funding exists. Yes. They understand contractual obligations. Yes. They comply with reporting requirements. Yes. But they appear completely disconnected from the actual governance structure supporting those relationships." Daniel folded his arms. "What conclusion do you draw?" Michael answered honestly. "None. Not yet. I simply find it unusual." Daniel appreciated the restraint. Professional investigators who rush toward conclusions often overlook the truth. Meanwhile, Christina sat in the backyard beneath a large oak tree while Ethan and Grace explored the grass for the first time. Everything fascinated them. Leaves, tiny flowers, shadows, even the breeze itself. Grace laughed every time a leaf drifted across the lawn. Ethan spent several minutes studying an ordinary pebble before proudly presenting it to Christina. She accepted it as though he had discovered treasure. "Thank you." Her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. "Daniel." She answered quietly. "How's the expedition?" "Ethan believes rocks deserve careful inspection." Daniel chuckled. "An excellent quality. What can I help with?" "I wanted to provide a routine update." "I'm listening." "The document comparison phase is progressing well. No concerns, no conclusions." She appreciated the wording. "And the review?" "Continuing exactly according to policy." "Good." Daniel hesitated. Michael asked an interesting question today. "What was it?" He wondered whether Harrison Development fully understands the governance structure supporting its institutional funding. Christina looked toward Ethan, who had now become fascinated by a butterfly. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. Which is, that understanding isn't required for funding." She smiled gently. "But respecting the agreements is." "Exactly." Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Daniel asked, "How are you?" Christina watched Grace clap excitedly at absolutely nothing. "Busy." "And happy." She considered the question carefully. "I'm peaceful." Daniel recognized the difference. Peace rarely depended upon circumstances. It depended upon acceptance. Back in Chicago, Olivia Sanders spent most of the afternoon reviewing historical financing. She opened files dating back nearly a decade. Early expansion, regional acquisitions, infrastructure investments, community redevelopment, everything connected through dozens of institutional partnerships. Eventually, she noticed something unexpected. Every few years, documentation referenced updated trustee certifications. She searched further. The certifications existed. The trustee's identity did not. She walked directly to Thomas Reed's office. "I found something." Thomas motioned toward a chair. What? She handed him several copies. Look at the signatures. Thomas compared the documents. Different law firms. Yes. Different institutional entities. Yes. But identical certification language. Thomas nodded slowly. They're all referring to the same governing authority. Exactly. He leaned back. Do we know who that authority is? Olivia answered with unusual frustration. No. Paul entered unexpectedly. You two look serious. Thomas gestured toward the papers. We've identified another common thread. Paul skimmed the documents. They're trustee certifications. Correct. So, Olivia looked directly at him. Who signs them? Paul shrugged. I assume some institutional administrator. Thomas exchanged a glance with Olivia. Neither answered immediately. Finally, Thomas spoke. We've spent 3 days trying to identify that administrator. And we haven't. Paul laughed lightly. I think we're chasing ghosts. Olivia's voice remained calm. No. I think we've spent years accepting a foundation we've never actually examined. That evening, Richard Coleman requested a private dinner with Paul. The restaurant overlooked Lake Michigan. Sunset reflected across the water while boats drifted quietly toward the harbor. Richard waited until their meals arrived before speaking. I want to ask you something personal. Paul looked surprised. Go ahead. When was the last time you took a full day away from work? Paul smiled. I don't remember. I suspected that. It's temporary. Richard nodded. So I've heard. Paul looked out across the lake. I'm building something that will last. Richard stirred his coffee. Perhaps. But lasting things require attention. They have mine. I'm not talking about the company. Paul understood immediately. My family, Richard nodded. Ethan and Grace are still very young. I know. And Christina, Paul hesitated. She's incredibly patient. Richard looked directly at him. Be careful not to mistake patience for permanence. Paul said nothing. Those words lingered longer than he expected. Late that night after returning home, Paul quietly opened the nursery door. Ethan slept curled on his side. Grace rested with one tiny hand stretched toward the empty space between their cribs. Christina sat nearby, reading beneath a dim lamp. She looked up. You're home early. It seems late to me. She smiled faintly. It is. Paul remained standing. They've grown. They have. I keep noticing changes. Children don't wait. He nodded slowly. I've missed too much. Christina closed her book. You've missed some things. I'll do better. She looked at him for several seconds. I hope you will. There was no anger, no accusation, only quiet sincerity. Paul almost sat down, almost stayed. Then his phone vibrated. He stared at the screen. Unknown number, business. He answered instinctively. I'll just take this. Christina nodded once. Of course. He stepped into the hallway. The call lasted 37 minutes. When he finally returned, Christina had carried both twins upstairs. The rocking chair sat empty. Only her book remained on the small table beside it. Paul picked it up absent-mindedly before noticing another object underneath. The familiar leather notebook. He hesitated. He knew he should not open it. He placed the book back exactly where he had found it and walked away. Across the country, Michael Carter completed another comparison before shutting down his computer. The final document of the evening confirmed what weeks of careful analysis had suggested. Every major institutional relationship eventually converged upon one governing authority. The name remained confidential. The legal structure remained intact. But one conclusion had become unavoidable. Someone possessed the lawful authority to influence the future of Harrison Development more profoundly than anyone sitting inside its executive boardroom. And remarkably, Paul still had no idea that person had been sharing his home all along. The first signs of true instability rarely arrived with noise. At Harrison Development, there were no alarms, no dramatic resignations, no sudden collapse of stock value. Instead, the shift appeared in something far more subtle: hesitation. Emails that once received instant replies now took hours. Requests that once passed through departments smoothly now required multiple approvals. Even meetings that used to end with confident decisions began lingering in uncomfortable silence. Paul noticed the change, but he interpreted it differently. To him, it felt like bureaucracy expanding in proportion to success. To Olivia Sanders, it felt like something far more deliberate. On a gray Thursday morning, Olivia sat in her office reviewing a consolidated risk report prepared by the finance team. She had requested the document twice. The first version was incomplete. The second version was better, but still left gaps. The third version finally told a clearer story. She leaned back slowly after reading it. Then she read it again. Thomas Reed entered without knocking. "You look like you've seen something you don't like." "I've seen something I don't understand." He closed the door. That usually means trouble. Olivia turned the report toward him. "Look at the dependency ratio." Thomas studied the page. "That's high. Too high." "For what?" "For any company that claims independent expansion capacity." Thomas frowned. "Explain." She pointed to a section highlighted in red. "Nearly every major development phase is supported by overlapping institutional funding sources." "Yes." "But those sources aren't independent." Thomas leaned closer. "They're connected." Olivia nodded. "Indirectly, yes." "But the pattern is too consistent." Thomas looked up. "You're suggesting coordination. I'm suggesting structure, which implies intent." Olivia did not answer immediately. Then she said quietly, "I think we've been looking at a system without understanding who designed it." Meanwhile, Paul stood inside a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor, speaking with 3 senior executives about upcoming acquisitions. He moved confidently between topics: capital allocation, market expansion, construction timelines, investor confidence. Everything flowed as it always had. Yet, when the meeting ended, Richard Coleman remained seated. Paul noticed. "Something on your mind?" Richard folded his hands. "Yes." Paul waited. "I've been reviewing our institutional funding structure." Paul sighed lightly. "Still, this isn't routine anymore." "It is routine." Richard shook his head. "No. Routine doesn't generate repeated verification requests from independent trustees." Paul leaned against the table. "You're overthinking paperwork." Richard looked at him carefully. "Paperwork doesn't usually ask the same question from 5 different directions." Paul paused. "What question?" "Who controls the authority behind our funding?" Paul smiled faintly. "We do." Richard held his gaze. "Do we?" The question lingered longer than either of them expected. Across town, Christina sat on the living room floor while Ethan attempted to stack soft blocks with determined seriousness. Grace had other plans. She kept knocking them down, immediately giggling each time. Christina watched quietly. "No agreement reached yet," she said softly. Her phone vibrated. Daniel Harper. She stepped into the kitchen before answering. "Good afternoon. I'll keep this brief. I'm listening." Michael Carter has completed another phase of review. Christina poured water into a glass while listening, and there is a pattern emerging. She remained calm. What kind of pattern? Not financial irregularity. Good. But structural centralization. Christina paused slightly. Explain. Multiple funding channels ultimately converge on a single governance authority. She already knew that. That is expected. Yes. But Harrison Development does not appear to have a clear understanding of that authority. Christina took a slow sip of water. They don't need to understand it. They only need to comply. Daniel agreed. Correct. But Michael is beginning to ask deeper questions, which is his job. Daniel hesitated. He's careful. I know. He doesn't draw conclusions without evidence. That's why he's useful. There was a pause. Then Daniel added, he may request identity confirmation soon. Christina placed the glass down. Then we will respond according to protocol. As always. Yes. Daniel accepted that answer. But something in his tone suggested curiosity had begun shifting into concern. After ending the call, Christina returned to the living room. Ethan had successfully stacked 3 blocks. Grace immediately knocked them down again. Both laughed. Christina smiled. Simple moments still mattered more than complex systems. At Harrison Development, Olivia and Thomas continued working late into the evening. The office was nearly empty now. Only the glow of monitors illuminated their desks. Olivia opened another file, then another, then another. Each contained funding certifications spanning nearly a decade. Thomas stood behind her chair. I keep coming back to the same issue. Olivia did not look away from the screen. Which one? Authority. She nodded. Same. Thomas pointed toward a document. This clause appears in almost every agreement. Olivia read aloud. Continuation of institutional participation subject to verification of controlling trustee confidence. She closed her eyes briefly. Yes. Thomas continued. But nowhere in executive records is that trustee identified. Olivia finally turned toward him. Do you think Paul knows? Thomas hesitated. No. Do you? I think he believes the system exists without ever asking who holds the key. Olivia leaned back. That's dangerous. It's also common. She stood and walked toward the window. Outside, Chicago lights reflected across wet pavement. Do you ever wonder, she said quietly, what happens when a company grows faster than its understanding of how it exists? Thomas answered honestly. Eventually, it meets the part of the system it never studied. The following morning, Paul entered the executive floor earlier than usual. Richard was already there. Olivia, too. Thomas stood near the conference table, holding a thick folder. Paul noticed immediately. Another meeting? Richard nodded. We need to clarify something. Paul exhaled. If this is about compliance again. It's not just compliance. Thomas placed the folder on the table. We've completed a full structural review of institutional funding relationships. Paul sat down. And, Olivia answered, every major expansion phase depends on certification of a controlling trustee. Paul shrugged. We've established that. Richard leaned forward. The problem is not the clause. Then what is it? Thomas spoke carefully. The problem is we cannot identify who fulfills it. Silence filled the room. Paul laughed once. You've got to be kidding. I'm not, Thomas replied. Olivia added, we've traced every documented pathway. And they all converge. Where? Olivia met his eyes. An undisclosed governing authority. Paul looked around the table. So you're telling me billions of dollars in funding depend on someone we can't name, Richard answered calmly. That's what the documentation shows. Paul stood up. That makes no sense. It makes legal sense, Thomas said, but not operational comfort. Paul shook his head. This is ridiculous. Richard remained composed. Then help us understand it. I don't need to understand it. Olivia replied quietly. That may be the problem. The meeting ended without resolution. But something had shifted. Not financially, not legally, mentally. Questions had moved from background noise into the center of every executive conversation. That evening, Christina bathed the twins. Ethan splashed water happily while Grace attempted to drink it directly from her hands. Christina laughed softly. You are both very creative. After bedtime, she sat alone in the nursery. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the monitor. Her secure laptop waited on the small table. A notification appeared. Michael Carter, preliminary summary report available. She opened it. The document contained careful language. No accusations, no warnings, only structured observations. Finding institutional funding network demonstrates unified governance dependency. Observation controlling authority not identified within beneficiary records. Conclusion. Compliance. Maintained pending verification of trustee identity. Christina closed the report. Nothing required immediate action. Everything remained within policy. Outside the nursery, Paul stood in the hallway. He had returned home earlier than expected. He watched Christina for a moment before she noticed him. You're quiet, he said. I was reading. Work? Trust matters. He nodded, then hesitated. Something is happening at the company. I know. Paul frowned. You do. Christina looked toward the sleeping twins. Patterns usually appear before explanations. What does that mean? It means you should listen carefully when people who understand systems begin asking questions. Paul didn't respond immediately. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger, uncertainty. And somewhere far beyond his awareness, documents were already moving through legal review channels that would eventually connect his company to an authority he had unknowingly been living beside for years. He simply didn't realize yet that the most important name in his entire professional life had never once appeared in his boardroom. The compliance hearing was scheduled without ceremony. No press release announced it. No public statement accompanied it. Even within Harrison Development, most employees only knew that an internal governance review had been escalated to formal proceedings. But inside the executive boardroom, the atmosphere felt entirely different. This was no longer routine paperwork. This was examination. Paul arrived early that morning expecting another extended discussion about documentation delays and institutional clarification. Instead, he found the room arranged differently. A long central table had been repositioned. Additional chairs had been added. Recording equipment sat quietly near the corner, its presence subtle but unmistakable. Richard Coleman was already seated. Olivia Sanders stood by the screen reviewing a structured timeline of documents. Thomas Reed arranged printed binders in precise stacks. No one spoke for nearly a minute after Paul entered. Finally, Richard gestured toward the seat at the center. Let's begin. Paul frowned slightly. This feels formal. It is, Richard replied. Thomas opened the first binder. Today's session is not investigative in the accusatory sense. Paul relaxed slightly. Good. It is verification-based. Paul paused. That sounds like the same thing with different wording, Olivia answered calmly. It's not. She clicked the remote. A structured diagram appeared on the screen. At the top, Harrison Development. Below it, multiple institutional funding channels. Below that, interconnected charitable investment partnerships. At the base, a single governing authority block labeled in neutral language. Controlling Trustee Verification Entity Confidential. Paul leaned forward. "What is that?" Thomas responded. "It's the reference used across funding agreements. I've seen it before." "Yes." "So, what's the issue?" Richard answered carefully. "We cannot locate the entity behind it." Paul stared. "That's impossible." "It's not missing," Olivia said. "It's undisclosed." Paul shook his head. Undisclosed by whose silence followed. Thomas finally said, "By the institutional governance structure itself." Paul let out a short laugh. "So we're all just pretending there's some invisible authority controlling billions of dollars?" Richard's voice remained steady. "We are not pretending." He pointed toward the screen. "We are documenting what every contract already states." Paul's expression hardened. "This is absurd." Olivia leaned forward. "Then explain why every major funding cycle requires certification from this authority." "I don't know," Paul snapped. "That's the point," Thomas said quietly. "You've been operating on approval that no one here can independently verify." Paul turned sharply toward him. "Are you suggesting our company is unstable?" "No," Thomas replied. "I'm suggesting your understanding of its foundation is incomplete." The word incomplete landed harder than expected. Paul sat back slowly. "That's not possible." Richard watched him carefully. "Why not?" "Because I would have been told." "By whom?" Paul hesitated. The question should have had an obvious answer. It didn't. Across the country, Christina stood in her kitchen preparing bottles, while Ethan and Grace played on the floor nearby. The morning light filtered through the windows softly. Her phone vibrated. Daniel Harper. She stepped aside before answering. "Good morning." "Good afternoon here," Daniel replied. "I assume the hearing has begun." "It has." And Daniel paused briefly. "The formal verification phase has been presented." Christina nodded. "Expected. There is some confusion among the executives. That is also expected." Daniel hesitated again. "They are asking for identity confirmation." Christina placed a bottle on the counter. "Of the controlling trustee?" "Yes." She looked toward the living room where Ethan had just managed to crawl over Grace's toy, prompting a brief protest. "Has Michael completed his review summary preliminary version only?" "Does it change anything?" "No." "Then the answer remains the same." Daniel understood immediately. Confidential under governing protocol. Until legal threshold requires disclosure, Christina confirmed. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I will communicate accordingly." "Thank you." After the call ended, Christina returned to her children. Grace was now attempting to balance a soft toy on Ethan's head. Ethan tolerated it for approximately 3 seconds before laughing and knocking it off himself. Christina smiled. The world of governance and financial structures felt distant in moments like this. Inside Harrison Development, the hearing continued. Thomas placed another document on the table. "This is the original funding agreement." Paul skimmed it quickly. "I've seen this." "Yes," Olivia said. "But look at the appendix." Paul read more carefully. His expression changed slightly. "Contingent upon ongoing trustee certification of fiduciary compliance." Richard nodded. "That clause appears in every major expansion authorization." Paul frowned. "So what?" Thomas answered. "So the continuation of funding depends on someone certifying that our governance meets required standards. And that someone is this controlling trustee." You keep mentioning yes. Paul leaned forward. Then why haven't I ever interacted with them? Silence. Olivia finally said, because there is no recorded requirement that you should. Paul stared at her. That makes no sense. Richard spoke calmly. It makes structural sense, not operational sense. Thomas added quietly, that distinction is what we are trying to understand. Paul stood up. This is going nowhere. Richard remained seated. It's going exactly where documentation leads. Paul looked around the room. You're telling me my entire company depends on a person who doesn't exist in any of our records? Olivia corrected him softly. Not doesn't exist, is not disclosed. Paul shook his head. That's the same thing. No, Richard said. It isn't. The meeting paused as tension filled the room. Then Thomas added something unexpected. There is another layer. Paul turned. What now? Thomas opened a sealed folder. Michael Carter identified succession documentation. Olivia frowned. Succession of what trust authority? Paul sat back down slowly, and Thomas continued. The transition occurred years before your company's major expansion phase. Richard narrowed his eyes. So someone took control before the funding scale increased. Yes. And that person is still active. We have no evidence otherwise. Paul's voice lowered. So we're building billion-dollar projects based on an approval system controlled by someone none of us have ever met. Olivia answered honestly. Yes. Paul laughed again, but this time without humor. That's insane. Richard looked at him steadily. Or extremely stable, depending on perspective. Paul stared at him. How can you say that? Because it has functioned without failure. Thomas added, and without transparency. The room fell silent again. That afternoon, Michael Carter finalized his preliminary summary. The document contained carefully neutral language. No speculation, no interpretation, only findings. Finding Harrison Development Funding Network relies on centralized fiduciary authority. Finding authority identity not disclosed within corporate governance records. Finding all historical funding approvals remain valid under existing trust compliance frameworks. He paused before adding one final note. Observation system integrity is high, but understanding of controlling governance is absent within beneficiary organization. Michael closed the file slowly. This was no longer just a financial structure. It was a system built on trust in something unseen. Meanwhile, Christina sat by the nursery window, holding Grace while Ethan slept against her shoulder. The twins were heavier now, stronger, more aware of the world around them. Her phone lit up softly. Daniel again. One more thing, he said. I'm listening. The executives may escalate requests for identity disclosure. Christina remained calm. And the response? Same protocol. Good. Daniel hesitated. But Christina? Yes, this is becoming harder for them to accept. She looked at Grace's tiny hand gripping her finger. Understanding always comes slowly when systems are larger than perception. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, do you ever think about how they will react when they finally understand? Christina answered without hesitation. I think about whether understanding will change anything that matters. Daniel understood exactly what she meant. Outside the nursery, Paul stood alone in the hallway that evening. He had returned home earlier than expected again. Through the slightly open door, he could hear Christina softly humming while rocking the twins. He almost stepped inside, almost asked a question, almost demanded clarity. Instead, his phone vibrated once more. Another meeting request. He stared at it for a long moment. then looked toward the nursery again. For the first time, the uncertainty in his professional life and the distance in his personal life began to feel strangely connected. But he still had no idea why. The hearing room felt different on the morning everything shifted. Not louder, not more crowded, not more dramatic, just heavier. As if the air itself understood that something previously theoretical was about to become undeniable. Paul arrived expecting clarification. He received evidence instead. Richard Coleman opened the session without preamble. "Today is not about interpretation," he said. "It is about documentation." Olivia Sanders activated the screen. A chronological timeline appeared. Harrison Development's growth history stretched across multiple years, each expansion marked by capital inflows, project approvals, and institutional funding confirmations. Thomas Reed stood beside the screen. "We will proceed step by step." Paul leaned back. "I've already seen most of this." "No," Thomas replied calmly. "You've seen summaries." The first document appeared. Original Expansion Authorization Agreement. Then another. Funding Approval Certification. Then another. Institutional Participation Confirmation. Each file displayed the same structure. Each contained the same dependency clause. And each referenced the same authority. Controlling Trustee Verification Entity. Paul's patience began to thin. "This is the same phrase again." "Yes," Olivia said. "So, what exactly are we proving?" Richard answered. "That every major expansion in your company's history required validation from a governing authority outside your organization." Paul shook his head. "We've always operated under institutional oversight." Thomas responded immediately. "This is not oversight." He pointed at the screen. "This is conditional authority." The phrase landed differently. Paul frowned. "What's the difference?" Olivia answered carefully. "Oversight monitors what you do." Thomas added, "Conditional authority determines whether what you do continues." Silence followed. Then Thomas clicked to the next section. A new document appeared. Archived Trustee Succession Record. The screen highlighted a partially redacted entry. Paul leaned forward. "What is that?" Olivia spoke softly. "Succession of controlling authority." Paul stared. "So this person changes?" "No," Thomas said. "The position continues. The identity remains confidential within institutional governance structure." Paul stood up abruptly. "That's ridiculous." Richard remained calm. "It is legal. That doesn't make it logical." Olivia replied, "Logic and legal frameworks are not always aligned with transparency," Thomas continued. "This transition occurred several years before your company's rapid expansion phase." Paul froze slightly. "What are you implying?" Richard answered without hesitation. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a timeline." Paul looked around the room. "So you're telling me someone took control of a massive trust, and every expansion I've built my career on depends on their approval?" "Yes," Olivia said. "And none of you know who it is." "That is correct," Thomas replied. The room fell completely silent. For the first time since the hearing began, Paul did not respond immediately. Instead, he sat down slowly, not in defeat, but in recalibration. His voice lowered. "That doesn't make sense." Richard leaned forward. "Neither did your company's growth until now." Paul looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means you have been operating inside a system whose foundation you never questioned," Thomas added gently. "And that system has now begun asking questions about you." Across the country, Christina stood in her kitchen watching Ethan and Grace attempt to stack wooden rings. Ethan concentrated intensely. Grace knocked the stack down immediately after completion. Both children laughed, as if they had agreed on the outcome in advance. Christina smiled faintly. Her phone vibrated. Daniel Harper. She stepped aside. "Proceeding as expected," Daniel said. "I assumed so. There is increased pressure for identity disclosure." Christina wiped a small handprint off the counter. "And the response protocol remains unchanged." She nodded. "Good." Daniel hesitated. "Michael's final analysis is complete." Christina paused. "And he confirms full structural dependency on the controlling trustee authority." She remained quiet. No irregularities, no violations. Then everything continues. Daniel exhaled slowly. "There is one more development." She listened. "The executives are beginning to suspect the controlling authority may have proximity to their internal operations." Christina's expression did not change. "That is not relevant. I know. But suspicion changes behavior." Christina looked toward the living room. Ethan had successfully balanced 3 rings. Grace immediately knocked them down again. She answered softly, "Behavior changes nothing about legal structure." Daniel agreed. "Yes, but it changes perception." Christina ended the call gently. Perception had never been part of governance. Only compliance mattered. Back in the hearing room, tension shifted into something more concentrated. Thomas placed a final document on the table. "This is the Consolidated Funding Dependency Map." Paul studied it carefully. For the first time, the structure was no longer abstract. It was visual. Lines connected institutional funds. Arrows traced capital flows. Branches merged into centralized authority points. And at the center of everything sat one node: unidentified governing authority. Paul stared at it. "This is impossible," Olivia answered. "It is accurate." Richard added quietly, "It is your company." Paul turned toward him. "My company does not depend on an invisible entity." Thomas responded without emotion. "Your company depends on verified authority you have never directly accessed." Paul ran a hand through his hair. "So what happens if that authority changes its mind?" Silence. That question had not been asked before. Olivia answered honestly. "Then funding eligibility changes." Paul's expression tightened. "Can it just stop?" Thomas nodded. "Yes." The room became still, not tense, not dramatic, simply still. Richard spoke slowly. "This is why we are here." Paul looked at him. "To find out who it is?" Richard shook his head. "No, to understand what the system requires." Paul sat back down again. For the first time, he stopped interrupting. He listened. That alone marked a shift. Meanwhile, Michael Carter submitted his final formal summary to the Trust Oversight Committee. His language remained precise. No interpretation, no speculation, only conclusion. Conclusion. Harrison Development operates under valid but externally controlled fiduciary authority structure. Conclusion. Beneficiary organization lacks visibility into controlling trustee identity as defined by governance framework. Conclusion system remains compliant under all reviewed conditions. He closed the file. Then added one final observation. Observation stability exists independently of understanding. At the Lewis Family Trust headquarters, Daniel forwarded the report to Christina. She reviewed it quickly, then closed it. Nothing required action. Everything remained within structure. That evening, Paul returned home later than usual. The house was quiet, except for the faint sound of the nursery monitor. He stood in the hallway for a long time, then slowly approached the open nursery door. Christina was inside, sitting between the cribs as Ethan and Grace slept. She looked up when he entered. "You're quiet tonight." Paul hesitated. "I had a meeting." She nodded. "They told me things I don't understand." Christina waited. He continued. "There's a controlling authority behind everything we've built." "I know." Paul frowned. "You know, yes?" Silence. He stepped closer. "You've known this entire time." Christina did not answer immediately. Then softly, "It was never relevant to your work." Paul stared at her. "How can it not be relevant? Because your obligations are independent of who grants approval. That doesn't make sense. It makes governance sense." Paul exhaled sharply. "So you're telling me everything I've done depends on someone I've never met? And you're just aware of it?" Christina looked at the sleeping twins. "Yes." Paul's voice lowered. "Who is it?" Christina finally looked at him. "That is not something I can disclose." "Why not?" "Because it is not permitted within the structure you are benefiting from." Paul stepped back slightly. "This is insane." Christina's tone remained calm. "It is structured." He ran a hand over his face. "You knew I was building all of this on something I couldn't see." "Yes. And you never told me. I followed the same rules everyone else follows." Paul looked at her for a long time. For the first time, the distance between them was not emotional. It was informational, and that gap felt far larger. Behind them, Ethan shifted in his sleep. Grace made a small sound and settled again. Christina stood. "I didn't hide anything from you, Paul." He looked at her sharply. "You didn't tell me." She met his gaze. "Because I was never allowed to." Silence filled the room, not angry, not loud, just final in a way neither of them had fully understood until that moment. And for Paul, standing in the dim nursery light, one truth finally began to surface. He had spent years building an empire, believing he understood its foundation. But the real foundation had never required his understanding at all. Only his compliance. The silence in the nursery did not end after Paul's question. It stretched. Not because anyone refused to speak, but because everything important had already been said in a way that could not be undone. Ethan shifted slightly in his sleep. Grace made a soft sound and settled again. The twins, unaware of the structural collapse happening in adult understanding, continued resting inside a world that still felt simple. Paul stood near the doorway. Christina remained beside the cribs. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Paul finally spoke again, quieter this time. "So everything I built was approved by someone I don't know." Christina answered without turning. "Everything you built was approved through a structure you agreed to operate within. That's not the same thing. It is legally the same thing." He exhaled sharply as if trying to find air inside a conversation that kept narrowing. "I should have been told." Christina turned slightly toward him. "You were told what you needed to know for your role." "My role," he repeated. "Yes." Paul laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "I'm the CEO of the company." "And you still are," she said calmly. "Then how can I not know who controls my funding?" Christina's voice remained steady. "Because control and visibility are not always shared in the same direction." That sentence lingered longer than anything else. Paul looked at her carefully now, as if seeing a different version of the woman he had lived beside for years. "You knew all of this before we got married." Christina did not deny it. "Yes, and you still let me believe I understood what was happening." "I let you operate within your understanding." Paul stepped back slightly. "That sounds like manipulation." Christina shook her head gently. "It is governance." The word felt colder than he expected. Behind them, Grace stirred and let out a small cry. Christina immediately turned, lifted her, and began rocking her slowly. The motion was instinctive, practiced almost invisible in its calmness. Paul watched her. Even now, in the middle of something that had destabilized his entire professional identity, she did not change. That realization unsettled him more than the information itself. In another part of the city, Harrison Development's legal and financial teams were still processing the implications of the compliance hearing. But now the tone had shifted. It was no longer about questioning funding consistency. It was about understanding hierarchy. In the boardroom, Richard Coleman sat alone with Thomas Reed reviewing the finalized governance framework again. Richard spoke quietly. So we are structurally dependent on an authority we do not directly interface with. Thomas nodded. Yes. And that authority has full discretion over continuation of funding within the contractual framework, yes. Richard leaned back slowly. Then the question is not whether we are compliant. Thomas looked at him. It is whether compliance is enough to guarantee continuity. Thomas did not answer immediately, because the honest answer was already in the documents. It was not guaranteed. It was evaluated. Elsewhere, Olivia Sanders was still at her desk when she noticed something she had overlooked before. A recurring clause across multiple funding agreements did not just mention compliance. It mentioned confidence. She highlighted the phrase again. Continuation subject to ongoing trustee confidence assessment. She leaned back. Confidence was not a financial term. It was a human one. And yet it governed billions of dollars in infrastructure. That contradiction made her uneasy in a way numbers never had. Back at the Lewis Family Trust, Michael Carter submitted his final expanded report. It contained no speculation, no emotion, only structured findings. Funding structure is valid. Governance authority is centralized. Beneficiary organization lacks direct identification of controlling trustee. Compliance remains intact under current conditions. He closed the file, then paused. After years of forensic work, he had learned something simple. Systems that survived the longest were not the ones people understood best. They were the ones people trusted without needing to understand them at all. That evening, Christina placed Grace back into her crib and sat down beside Ethan. Paul remained standing near the doorway. He spoke again, slower now. If I had known this from the beginning, I would have made different decisions. Christina looked at him. Possibly. That's all you have to say. It's the only honest answer. Paul frowned. So my entire career is built on conditional approval from someone I've never met. And you're saying that's just normal, Christina answered calmly. It is structured. It is legal. It is consistent. That's not what I asked. She looked at him directly now. Then ask the question you actually mean. Or Paul hesitated. For the first time, his frustration was not directed outward. It turned inward. Why didn't you ever tell me you had access to all of this? Christina did not hesitate. Because access was never the same as involvement. That doesn't answer my question. It does. Paul shook his head. I don't understand you. Christina's voice softened slightly. You never needed to. That sentence landed differently. Not as rejection, but as separation. A boundary that had always existed, but only now became visible. Paul stepped closer. So what happens now? Christina gently adjusted Ethan's blanket. Nothing changes unless governance requires it. That's it, yes. And this authority, whoever it is, they decide everything. They decide eligibility, she corrected. Paul exhaled slowly. And you? Christina looked at him. I maintain structure integrity. Paul stared at her for a long moment. You're not afraid of any of this? Christina shook her head. Fear is not part of governance. That answer felt final, not dramatic, not emotional, just absolute. Several days later, Harrison Development held a closed executive session without external observers. The tone was no longer exploratory, it was procedural. Richard opened the meeting. We now operate with confirmed awareness of structural dependency. No one disputed it. Thomas added, the next phase is adjustment of internal compliance frameworks. Olivia nodded. Documentation alignment will be required across all departments. Paul sat quietly. He had not spoken much since the hearing concluded, not because he lacked opinions, because he no longer trusted them to be complete. Richard looked at him. Paul, he raised his eyes. Yes, you are still CEO, I am aware. But do you understand what has changed? Paul paused. Yes, then corrected himself. Not fully. Richard accepted that answer. Then understand this nothing you have built is invalid. Paul frowned slightly. But it is dependent on governance. You do not control. Thomas added carefully. And that is not unusual in institutional systems. Olivia looked down. It just becomes uncomfortable when you realize it. That evening, Paul returned home early. Christina was in the kitchen preparing dinner while Ethan and Grace played on the floor. The atmosphere was normal. Too normal. As if nothing fundamental had shifted. Paul stood in the doorway for a long time before speaking. I keep thinking about what you said. Christina didn't turn around. Which part? That I didn't need to understand it. She nodded. Yes, that still doesn't feel right. Christina placed a bowl on the table. Feelings and systems rarely align perfectly. Paul walked closer. I built everything believing I was in control. Christina finally faced him. You are in control of your actions. That's not what I meant. I know. Silence again. Then Paul asked something more honest. Did you ever see me as actually in control? Christina did not answer immediately. Not because she wanted to avoid the question, but because she was choosing the most accurate answer. Finally, she said, I saw you as responsible for your decisions. Paul looked down slightly. That's different. Yes. He nodded slowly. For the first time, he did not argue. Behind them, Ethan laughed as Grace knocked over a small toy again. Normal life continued inside the same house where structural reality had just been exposed. And in that contrast, Paul began to understand something uncomfortable. He had never been outside the system. He had simply never been shown its edges. Spring arrived quietly in Chicago, the way most significant changes do when no one is paying attention. At Harrison Development, the atmosphere had shifted again, not into chaos, but into something more controlled. Meetings were shorter. Reports were more precise. Every department had begun quietly adjusting its language, as if learning to speak around an invisible framework that had always existed, but was only now being acknowledged. Paul noticed the change immediately, not in structure, but in behavior. People no longer spoke about expansion with unchecked certainty. They spoke about alignment, verification, and governance readiness. Words that once felt like background administrative language had become central to every decision. He understood why. But understanding did not make it easier. Richard Coleman called a board session that morning, but this time, the tone was different. Not investigative, not exploratory, finalizing. We are moving into restructuring, Richard said calmly as everyone took their seats. Olivia Sanders opened her laptop. Financial controls will be updated to reflect verified institutional requirements. Thomas Reed added, legal documentation will be standardized across all funding agreements to ensure compliance alignment. No one objected. There was nothing left to object to. Paul listened quietly, then finally spoke. So this is it. Richard looked at him. This is adaptation. Paul nodded slowly. That's another word for it. Thomas replied, it is the only appropriate response to confirmed governance structure. Silence followed. Then Paul leaned back. And what happens to expansion? Olivia answered carefully. It continues under stricter verification parameters. Paul exhaled. So nothing stops. No, Richard said. But nothing continues unchecked either. That distinction mattered. It meant control had never been absolute. It had always been conditional. And now that condition was fully visible. Meanwhile, at the Lewis Family Trust, Christina reviewed the final governance summary for Harrison Development. Daniel Harper stood beside her in the conference room. The restructuring request from their board has been received, he said. Christina nodded. And approved under standard compliance review. Yes. Any issues? Daniel shook his head. None. Michael's final audit confirms full alignment with trust governance requirements. Christina closed the file. Then the system is working. Daniel studied her for a moment. They are beginning to understand more now. Understanding was always inevitable. Even for Paul, Christina paused slightly. Yes. Daniel hesitated. And how is he handling it? Christina's expression remained neutral, as expected. Daniel accepted that answer, because in her world, emotional outcomes were never part of structural governance. At Harrison Development, the restructuring phase moved quickly. Legal documents were revised. Financial controls tightened. Board approvals became more formalized. Every expansion now required explicit confirmation of institutional eligibility before proceeding. Paul found himself attending more governance meetings than investor presentations. It felt unfamiliar, but not incorrect, just different. One afternoon, Richard approached him after a session. You've been quiet lately. Paul nodded. I'm adjusting. Richard studied him. That's good. Paul looked out the window. I used to think control meant speed. Richard responded, most people do. Paul added quietly, now I think it means understanding what you're allowed to move, not just how fast you can move it. Richard smiled faintly. That's a more accurate definition. Across town, Christina pushed Ethan and Grace in a stroller through a quiet neighborhood park. The twins were older now, more aware, more expressive. Ethan pointed at everything he saw as if the world required constant documentation. Grace insisted on stopping every few minutes to examine leaf stones or passing dogs. Christina walked slowly, matching their rhythm. Her phone vibrated. Daniel. She answered without stopping. Good afternoon. The restructuring is complete on their side, Daniel said. Final approval issued. Good. There is one observation. Christina waited. Paul has requested clarification on trustee identity again. She remained calm, and the response as before. Confidential under governance protocol. Christina nodded. Correct. Daniel hesitated. He seems more reflective. Christina looked down at Ethan, who had just dropped a small toy, and immediately insisted she retrieve it. That is expected. Do you think he understands now? Christina answered simply. He understands enough to operate correctly. Daniel accepted that. But he added quietly and emotionally. Christina paused. Then replied, that is not a governance category. She ended the call. The wind moved gently through the trees above the park. Nothing about the world had changed visibly. But everything had changed structurally. That evening, Paul returned home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, except for the faint sounds of the twins playing in the living room. Christina was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Paul stood at the entrance for a moment before speaking. Everything is different now. Christina didn't turn. Yes, he stepped closer. But the company is still functioning. Yes, and nothing collapsed. No. Paul nodded slowly. So it wasn't instability. Christina finally looked at him. It was structure becoming visible. Paul leaned against the counter. I used to think I understood the foundation. Christina replied softly. You understood your access to it. He looked at her. That still doesn't feel like the same thing. It isn't. Silence followed. Then Paul asked, if I had known earlier, would I have done anything differently? Christina considered the question carefully. Possibly. He frowned. That's not very comforting. It's not meant to be. Paul exhaled slowly. Do you ever think about how strange this all is? Christina placed a pot on the stove. No. Why not? Because it is not strange within its own system. Paul watched her. You talk about it like it's normal. It is normal, she replied. For you, for governance. He shook his head slightly. I still don't know how to feel about it. Christina met his gaze. You don't need to feel anything to operate within it. That sounds cold. It is precise. Paul nodded slowly. Precision was something he understood professionally. Emotionally, it felt unfamiliar in this context. Later that night, after the twins were asleep, Paul stood alone in the nursery. Christina entered quietly. You're still thinking? He didn't look at her immediately. Yes. About what? About how close I was to something I never understood. Christina remained beside him. You were never meant to understand it fully. He turned slightly. Then what was I meant to do? Build within it. Paul looked at the sleeping twins. And if I had refused, Christina answered honestly, then you would not have built what you built. That answer settled differently, not harsh, just factual. Paul nodded slowly. So success wasn't mine alone, Christina corrected gently. Your actions were yours. He looked at her, and everything behind them was structure. Paul exhaled. For the first time, he did not try to argue with the concept. Instead, he accepted its existence. Not comfortably, but clearly. Behind them, Ethan shifted slightly in sleep. Grace made a soft sound and settled again. The house remained quiet. Paul spoke again, softer now. Where does that leave me? Christina looked at their children. Exactly where you have always been. He frowned. That doesn't feel like an answer. It is, she said gently. You just understand it differently now. Paul stood there for a long moment, then nodded. For the first time, not in confusion, but in recognition. And somewhere beyond the walls of the house, the system they had both been part of continued operating, exactly as it always had, unchanged, precise, and indifferent to whether those inside it fully understood the shape of what held them. Fan 15. Several months passed without any dramatic conclusion. There was no collapse, no public scandal, no triumphant revelation that reshaped headlines overnight. Instead, life adjusted itself the way large systems always do after pressure changes slowly, quietly, and with a kind of irreversible normality. Harrison Development continued operating, but differently now. Meetings were shorter and more structured. Every expansion proposal required formal governance verification before moving forward. Financial forecasts were no longer treated as promises, but as conditional outcomes dependent on institutional approval. Paul adapted to it in the only way that mattered. He stopped fighting the structure, not because he agreed with it, but because he finally understood it did not respond to resistance. It responded to compliance. Richard Coleman noticed the change first. Paul was still ambitious, still sharp, still capable of leading large-scale strategy discussions. But something fundamental had shifted in how he approached decisions. He no longer spoke as though certainty belonged to him. One afternoon, after a routine board session, Richard walked beside him through the empty executive corridor. "You've changed," Richard said. Paul didn't deny it. "I've understood more." Richard nodded slowly. "That's not always the same thing as comfort." Paul gave a faint, tired smile. "No, it isn't." Richard stopped near the window overlooking the city. "Do you regret it?" Paul looked out at Chicago for a long moment before answering. "I regret thinking I understood it completely." Richard studied him. That's rare honesty. Paul shrugged slightly. "It's the only kind that makes sense now." Meanwhile, Christina's life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost deceptively simple. Ethan and Grace were growing quickly now. Talkative, curious, constantly moving between discovery and chaos. Ethan asked questions about everything. Grace insisted on touching everything twice, as if verifying reality required confirmation. Christina did not resist their curiosity. She guided it. One afternoon, while the twins played in the living room, Daniel Harper called. "The trust review cycle is complete," he said. Christina sat near the window. Any adjustments required none. "Good. There is one final administrative note." She waited. "The Harrison Development account remains fully compliant under current governance conditions." Christina nodded. "And they're restructuring stable." Daniel paused slightly. And Paul Christina looked toward the living room, where Ethan was carefully stacking blocks, while Grace waited to knock them down again. "He is aligned with structure." Daniel accepted that answer. But after a pause, he added, "And personally," Christina did not look away from her children. "He is learning the difference between control and participation." Daniel exhaled quietly. "That's a difficult lesson." "It is not optional," she replied. After the call ended, Christina remained seated for a long time, not thinking about governance, not thinking about systems, only watching her children grow in real time without interruption from anything beyond their small, immediate world. Later that evening, Paul returned home earlier than usual. He found Christina in the kitchen while the twins played nearby. For a moment, he simply stood there, not as a CEO, not as a man trying to understand an invisible structure, just as someone returning home. Christina noticed him. "You're early. I finished what I needed to." She nodded. "That's new." He smiled faintly. "I'm learning what a finished actually means now." She turned back to the stove. "And what does it mean?" Paul hesitated. "That it doesn't always mean control." Christina didn't respond immediately. Then quietly, "That's correct." He leaned against the counter. "I used to think everything important would eventually make sense if I worked hard enough to understand it." Christina stirred the pot slowly. And now Paul looked toward the living room where Ethan had just successfully stacked 3 blocks before Grace knocked them down again. "Now I think some systems don't require understanding to function." Christina nodded slightly. "Yes, that still feels strange." "It is only unfamiliar," she corrected. Paul looked at her. "You knew that from the beginning." Christina met his gaze calmly. "I knew the structure, and you never thought I needed to know it. It was not required for your responsibilities." Paul nodded slowly. There was no anger in him anymore, only comprehension. "I spent years believing I was building something independent. Christina replied softly. You were building within something already established. He accepted that now, without resistance. Later that night, after the twins had fallen asleep, Paul stood in the nursery doorway longer than usual. Christina joined him. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Paul said, "If someone asked me now, who controls my company?" He paused. I still wouldn't have a name. Christina answered gently, "You don't need one." He looked at her. That still feels like the most difficult part. It is the least important part, she said. Paul frowned slightly. Then what is important? Christina looked at Ethan and Grace sleeping peacefully. That the structure continues to function without harm. Paul considered that. So stability matters more than visibility. Yes. He nodded slowly. For the first time, he did not challenge it. Outside the nursery, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from balance. Paul spoke again. Where does this leave us? Christina answered without hesitation. Exactly where we have always been. He looked at her. I don't think I understood that before. You understand it now, she said. Paul stood there for a long moment, then finally nodded. Not with confusion, not with resistance, but with acceptance of something larger than himself. A system that had never been hidden, only unspoken, and somewhere beyond their home, beyond their conversations, beyond even their understanding of it. The structure that governed everything continued operating exactly as it always had. Quiet, unchanged, and absolute in its indifference to who finally understood it.